Right here is a guy called John Hewson. He's just become the new leader of the Liberal Party and is about to expose a secret meeting that had taken place.
Will the Prime Minister please tell for the record the whole story of the Kirribilli House conspiracy? Why were Sir Peter Abels and Bill Kelty in attendance? Exactly what promises did the Prime Minister make to the member for Blaxland? Exactly what promises did the member for Blaxland make to the Prime Minister? What promises did both make to the union boss and the millionaire businessman who were their chosen seconds? And are there any other aspects of the deal yet to be revealed?
What he's referring to here is the Kirribilli Agreement. Effectively a truce deal signed between Prime Minister Bob Hawke and his deputy, Paul Keating. Hawke would pass on leadership to Keating, but not until after the 1990 election. However, Hawke had no intention of keeping his end of the bargain.
This is utter insanity. Nothing but total lies are about to take down Keating. We've got to do something about that.
So I'm going to begin the story as late as 1988. By this point, Hawke had been in for half a decade and his treasurer, Paul Keating, had completely revolutionised the Australian economy. Now, these two men couldn't have had more different backgrounds. Hawke grew up boasting that one day he'd become the Prime Minister of Australia, his uncle was the Premier of Western Australia, and he even went on to study at Oxford. He then joined the Australian Council of Trade Unions as a lawyer and became its president, to which, I kid you not, he became an informant to America. At one stage, Rupert Murdoch was going to help Hawke break the pro-US faction of the Labor Party away from Gough Whitlam. As the president of the ACTU, he was Labor royalty and joined Parliament, quickly becoming Labor leader.
So how was Paul Keating's story different to this?
Well, for starters, he grew up in Bankstown, which for non-Sydney viewers is our punching bag suburb. He left school at 14 years old, then managed a rock band before being tutored by Australia's most combative ever leader, Jack Lang. Lang himself was once untouchable in New South Wales Labor, but during World War II fell out with the Australian Labor leadership and was exiled from the party. Right before Lang's death, Keating helped him make amends with the party and at 25 years old was elected as the member for Blaxland in 1969. Lang's bit of advice for Keating was this.
They'll say you have plenty of time. The truth is, you haven't a second.
By the way, it might surprise you to know how socially conservative Keating was, actually outdoing the Libs. In his maiden speech, he said that the Liberals' boasting of increasing female employment was instead something to be ashamed of. He was briefly made a minister by Gough Whitlam, but Whitlam was sacked before Keating could do anything. When Labor was in opposition, he supported making Hawke the leader, and when Hawke brought Labor into government, Keating was rewarded with the role of treasurer, taking over from John Howard. Remember that detail. Now, the first 5 years in office were incredible. Seismic economic reforms were made, such as floating the dollar, allowing foreign banks into Australia, phasing out tariffs, and introducing franking credits to avoid double taxation. What was also interesting was that both of their personas swapped in the 80s. The Oxford scholar became the man of the people, such as calling for bosses to give their employees a day off when Australia won the America's Cup.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
And the working class Keating donned expensive suits and exchanged sports for the opera and high society art. He was also an absolute wrecking ball in Parliament.
The proven corrupt party. Order. Half of the former Queensland Cabinet is in jail. And, Mr Speaker, we got the leader of the National Party up asking, Mr Speaker, we got the leader of the National Party up asking questions about issues of propriety. Don't make us laugh.
So by 1988, of course, one member of Hawke's cabinet rose to be preeminent amongst all. One man had been the major driver of policy reform, and one man had prosecuted Labor's case in Parliament like no other.
So you're telling me Paul Keating was on the council, but was not given the rank of master?
Exactly. And remember Lang's advice to Keating.
You haven't a second.
So in 1988, the case that Keating rather than Hawke be the leader started to grow stronger. The former Labor leader and now Hawke's foreign minister, Bill Hayden, said Keating was Hawke's rightful successor. So if this wasn't high enough praise, Keating's rival as heir to Hawke's throne, Kim Beazley, also agreed that it should be Keating rather than Kim to take over the throne. Finally, Bob Hawke actually also agreed. So the real question then was, when would Bob Hawke hand over the reins to Keating? In 1988, he was only age 60, and others like Robert Menzies had a lifespan of decades in the top job. From Keating's point of view, by the time he received the keys to the kingdom, the ship could have well and truly sunk. On top of that, though we don't know this, the general consensus in Labour was that when Hawke got Keating to support him for the leadership, he said to him, "2 terms will do me." By 1988, Hawke was at just about the end of his second term in office and showed no signs of stepping down. With Hawke's approval rating so high, Keating wanted to formalise the succession as soon as possible, and in June, the two met together in Kirribilli House. To ensure the deal was honoured, 2 witnesses were present as both signed an agreement to have Hawke hand over the leadership to Keating, but not until after the 1990 election. Whenabouts in the third term that would be up to Hawke. Should Keating make knowledge of this deal to the public, the deal was off. The deal worked for both. Keating's key backers were usually the New South Wales Right faction, but even they'd refused to support him in a coup. For Hawke, he'd have a new foe as John Howard was dumped as the opposition leader and was replaced with Andrew Peacock. While it'd still take a bit for the Libs to win, losing Keating certainly would have hurt. And so Keating fell in line and took the attack to Peacock.
Who is running the Liberal Party? Is it Mr Elliott, or is it the Leader of the Opposition who's been not impolitely told to back off?
Despite suffering a minor swing against him, Hawke emerged victorious in 1990, winning 78 to 69 seats. In 1990, Hawke decided that it still wasn't time. America had begun the Gulf War, and Hawke pledged his full support. In 1991, New South Wales was also going to a state election, and Bob Carr's Labor had a chance of taking down Nick Greiner's Liberals. Hawke used both of these as justifications not to step down just yet. Like I said before, Keating loved his opera, so much so that this next scandal would take the name of Spanish opera singer Placido Domingo. So on a Friday night, late in 1990, Keating spoke to about 150 journalists with one proviso. This was a speech that was to be off the record. In his speech, he mentioned the great US leaders, Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, and added that Australia had never had such a leader. This was widely considered to be a pop at the popular Hawke. On top of this, Keating had a go at Labor legend John Curtin. Curtin was a factional enemy of Lang's, and Keating dismissed his impact behind the Australian war effort. Keating then called himself the Placido Domingo of Australian politics. Not exactly a reference understood by the common man, but essentially a reference to his ability to articulate the beauty of Labor's policies as though it were a symphony. It was a strange speech, but given that it was off the record, it was always going to be a bit more rogue. As you can probably guess where the story's going to go, unfortunately, it turned out to be very much on the record and was published the next day. In what was pure embarrassment for Keating, he had to go to Hawke with his tail between his legs. But that wasn't even the worst of his issues.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
By 1990, Australia was in a pretty bad recession. In the September quarter, the economy contracted by 1.5%, mortgage rates stood at 18%, and the unemployment rate had risen 3 percentage points throughout the year to stand at 10.8%. Now, context is important here. From Hawke entering government onwards, the economy was growing at a rate of about 2 to 5% each year. This was because of the policies that I mentioned earlier, in which we actually have 2 whole podcasts where we unpack them all. So when Australia entered a recession, it was going backwards from a very healthy point, and was kind of actually convenient in slowing the inflation that came with this boom in the 80s. Unfortunately, though Keating did have a point, he really tipped off the public when he said this.
The most important thing about that is, this is a recession that Australia had to have.
Again, rising interest rates put a ton of pressure on mortgage payments, and for the thousands of people that were laid off from their jobs throughout 1990, Keating's words were of little solace, instead outraging them. By the end of 1990, Keating's ill discipline had caused his star to seriously wane, and Hawke pounced. After forcing Keating to apologise, Hawke considered both of these incidents as just cause to renege on the Kirribilli Agreement. Of course, this incensed Keating. Both would then consider the other to be the traitor, and tensions were reaching unparalleled levels. But I'm going to hit pause on this side of the aisle and jump across to the Libs. So after Malcolm Fraser lost the 1983 election to Hawke, 2 Libs contested for the empty chair. Andrew Peacock, and John Howard. Peacock won but was impotent in taking down Hawke, so under pressure from within, resigned and was replaced by Howard. However, Howard also struggled to make an impact and lost the 1987 election. Keating also routinely tore him in the parliament, even calling him a dead carcass swaying in the breeze. Unable to make gains in terms of economic policy, Howard resorted to culture war tactics, protesting against a potential apology to Indigenous Australians. However, as we saw before, Peacock mounted a coup against Howard and took the leadership back off of Howard before losing the 1990 election to Bob Hawke. He then stood down after the defeat, and a guy called John Hewson was elected. Now, all this turmoil meant that despite Hawke and Keating's 1990 woes, Labor could survive somewhat undamaged. But John Hewson was built different. Whereas Howard had been outgunned on economics, Hewson had been an economist by trade, and he launched the Fight Back campaign. While Hawke and Keating liberalised the economy, they rejected gutting the public service like other 80s leaders such as Thatcher and Reagan. Hewson's plan to fight back against the Hawke government included the abolition of employment awards, removing bulk billing for just about everyone except veterans and those with disabilities, a $13 billion income tax cut that would be somewhat offset with a $10 billion reduction in spending. By 1991, Hewson was gaining momentum. Given the constant Liberal leadership changes, he was polling at just 31% as preferred Prime Minister, but by 1991, that would rise to 51%. As the middle of the year loomed, Labor were looking in serious danger of losing the 1993 election. Hawke might have made it clear that he wasn't going to step down, but he could always be pushed. And that's where this guy comes into the story, Graham Richardson. Some of you would even know him as Richo from Sky News.
The Labor Party's been rejected a couple of times in a row.
3.
They like Scott Morrison. There's no doubt about that. I think he's proven that.
But his Mark Latham story arc is a story for another day. Back in the 80s and the 90s, Richo actually used to be a hugely influential power broker within the party, controlling the pro-Keating New South Wales right faction. It might also surprise you to know that he was Hawke's Minister for the Environment and helped chalk up some massive green wins, such as getting the Daintree listed on the UNESCO World Heritage List and blocking a pulp mill with high waste in Tasmania. This was to try and stop the prospect of a renegade Greens party, and was probably quite helpful in delivering Hawke his 1990 victory. For his role in this, Richardson expected his own personal pick of a ministry, but Hawke put him in as Minister for Defence, something that he didn't want. Frustrated with Hawke, he gave Keating the green light to mount a coup, with his New South Wales right faction falling right behind it. Having reneged on the Kirribilli agreement, Keating decided that Hawke was fair game and launched his spill motion in June of 1991. His supporters were a weird combination of the New South Wales right and then the centre-left of the party. However, other powerful cordons like Tasmania, Queensland and the broader left decided to stick with Hawke. Keating certainly pushed Hawke close, but fell just short with 44 votes compared to Hawke's 66. Let me know in the comments below, who would you have voted for? Hawke or Keating? As to what would happen next, there was no question. Keating would have to resign as Treasurer and retire to the backbench. When Parliament came to resit, of course, Hewson went straight for the kill.
Yesterday, the former Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Keating, described your government as lacking energy, leadership, political strategy, esprit de corps, cohesion and camaraderie. In other words, your government is a divided, directionless rabble, which he believed will now ebb out of office. That was yesterday. What has changed?
Given how crucial Keating had been to Hawke's succession, downplaying his contribution wasn't an option, and Hawke had this to say about Keating.
We have lost one of our better performers, and of course we have. And we will miss him. We will miss him. We've lost one of our better performers. But, Mr Speaker...
Order.
Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that fact, and I regret it.
With Keating now gone as both Treasurer and Deputy Prime Minister, he had impossible shoes to fill. Brian Howe took over as Hawke's deputy, while John Kerrin had the unenviable task of guiding Labor through the recession as Treasurer. However, he struggled to effectively retort Hewson's fightback policies and had a gaffe where he forgot the meaning of gross operating surplus on a financial statement. By the end of the year, much of the Labor caucus was furious that this guy had been chosen to such a prized role, and with the recession worsening, Hawke dumped him as Treasurer. In November, the Barbarians were at the gate, and Hewson really looked like he was picking Labor apart. In response to members of Hawke's cabinet publicly disagreeing with each other over building a third runway at Sydney Airport, Hewson said this.
Does the Prime Minister's peculiar version of government include any principle of collective ministerial responsibility? And does the Prime Minister expect the Minister to follow the example of the member for Barton and resign from the ministry? Or will the Prime Minister roll over and let the Minister openly challenge his rapidly vanishing authority?
Having had a dignified and long-standing run as Prime Minister, many were trying to pressure Hawke to resign, save face, and have Labor come out unscathed. Hawke had other ideas.
Tenuous tonight as he dares his Labor colleagues to dump him.
It's now widely anticipated that senior federal ministers who had previously been Hawke supporters will approach Mr Hawke and ask him to stand down from the job he has held for almost 9 years.
Hawke wasn't about to just pass off the top job to who he considered to be a traitor, and he was clear. If he was going to go, he had to be pushed. With his personal approval rating dropping to 26% by December, the caucus went to Keating with a desperate plea to challenge. Keating needed to know he had the numbers, but he was given complete assurance. As they went to the ballot room, it was mighty close. Hawke received 51 votes, Keating received 56. For the first time in nearly a decade, there was a new Labor leader. In an ironic twist of fate, Hawke had to hand his resignation to the Governor-General, the man that he'd ousted as leader of Labor, Bill Hayden. Hawke's seat of Wills went to a by-election, and Hawke had become so stale that Labor lost the seat to an independent. The Hawke divide would carry on for decades after this, with the two only reconciling just weeks out from Hawke's death in a joint endorsement of Bill Shorten against Scott Morrison in 2019. As for Keating as Prime Minister, it was now time to step up and take the position that his mentor Jack Lang never held. He was about to become the most combative Prime Minister we ever had, but to understand why Keating thought the way that he did, you really have to watch this video to see how his mentor nearly brought Australia to civil war.